You walk out to your shed on a crisp autumn evening, pull the cord on that heavy gasoline generator, and listen to it roar to life. It coughs, rattles the metal walls, and begins to consume expensive fuel just so you can run a single freezer or keep a few light bulbs burning. Every hour it runs, you are paying a toll. Or perhaps you look at the glossy magazines showing modern off-solar systems, monolithic glass arrays, computerized racks that look like server rooms, and invoices that could buy a good team of horses. People have been taught to believe that having your own power requires either a constant modern expense or a dependency on a team of high-priced technicians who speak in a dialect of code and engineering degrees. Understand this. It does not have to be that way. There is a sharp contrast between what the market wants to sell you and what a person actually needs to be self-sufficient. For generations, my people have lived by a simple rule. If you do not understand a tool, you do not own it. It owns you. A few years back, when I first started looking into taming the sun to help with the heavy lifting around our farm in Lancaster County, I was told the same things you were likely told. Elias, they said, it is too complex. One wrong wire, and you will burn the barn down. Leave it to the fellas with the trucks and the certifications. But I sat down with an old friend, a master practitioner, who had been running his workshop on independent power since before the modern solar boom even had a name. He didn't show me blueprints or digital schematics. He laid 4 simple boxes on a wooden bench, took a piece of thick copper wire, and showed me the natural order of things. My grandfather used to say that nature always provides the template for human work. Water flows from the spring into the bucket, then to the thirsty animal. Electricity follows the exact same quiet law. It is not a mystery meant only for a priestly class of technicians. It is a useful servant, though it remains a dangerous master if approached with a careless hand. Now, let us look at this with an honest eye. I am not going to tell you that a simple, hand-built solar setup will run your entire life without a care. It will not. This is where the exaggeration of the internet falls away. A modest system that you can assemble yourself in a single afternoon will not run a modern central air conditioner. It will not run an electric cook stove or heat your home in January. Those things require a massive industrial push of energy that a small setup cannot give. If that is what you want, this path is not for you. But if your goal is practical resilience, keeping a chest freezer full of summer harvest from spoiling when the main grid goes dark, running a well pump, keeping the oil lamps put away because you have clean, silent light in the evening, or keeping your tools charged, then this simple method is a proven truth. How did people manage before we became dependent on a continuous wire running from a distant powerhouse? They used localized, understandable energy. Water wheels, wind pumps, and simple storage. Modern science hasn't changed the rules of energy. It has only changed the boxes we put it in. The institutes and the engineers will give you long equations for what happens inside a solar cell, but the physical reality remains as simple as catching rainwater in a cistern. Why is it, then, that the manuals make it sound like an impossible riddle? Why do the wires look like a tangled nest of confusion to a beginner? It is because there is no profit in telling a man he can achieve comfort with 4 basic components and his own 2 hands. There is great profit in the monthly bill, and there is great profit in keeping you fearful of your own capability. The moment you see how these pieces talk to one another, you stop being a dependent customer and you become a producer. Stop and think about what we are actually doing here. We are taking the wild, uneven energy of the sun and taming it so it can sit quietly in a lead acid or lithium cell until we have need of it. When you look at a pile of solar components, your eyes see a maze of terminals, positive and negative signs, and heavy cables. It looks intimidating. But every single system, from a tiny one that charges a lantern to a massive array that powers a sawmill, relies on the exact same 4 core pieces working in the exact same sequence. If you connect them in the wrong order, you can confuse the brains of the system, or cause a sharp, violent arc that ruins your investment in a fraction of a second. But if you follow the proper order, the traditional sequence that respects how electricity flows, it comes together as naturally as building a sturdy timber frame. You need to understand the behavior of the heart of the system before you ever attach the source of the power. Almost every beginner makes the fatal mistake of pointing the panel at the sun and dragging the live wires down first. They want to see the power immediately. That impatience is exactly how components get fried. I want you to picture those 4 pieces sitting on the bench right now. The panel that catches the light, the small regulator box that tames the flow, the heavy battery that acts as the reservoir, and the inverter that changes that stored power into the kind of current your household appliances recognize. Each has one job. The magic isn't in the boxes themselves. The magic is entirely in the order of the handshake between them. Let us prepare the workspace. You take off your ring, you put away the loose metal tools, and you prepare to make the very first connection. The one that sets the foundation for everything else. The one that tells the system how to behave safely before the power of the sun ever touches the copper. Now, look down at that heavy, dark box sitting on your floor. The battery. It smells faintly of rubber and acrid acid, a dense, silent weight that holds the potential for great work. Beside it is your charge controller, a small rectangular housing with a cold digital screen and a row of brass screw terminals at the bottom. We begin here. Step 1 is the crucial handshake between these two. You take your first wire. It should be a proper copper strand, insulated in a thick jacket of deep red. This is your positive line. You strip back a ½ inch of the insulation, revealing the bright, salmon-colored copper threads, twisting them tight between your fingers, so no stray hairs stick out to cause a short. You insert this bare copper end into the terminal on the charge controller marked with a small plus sign, or perhaps a tiny stamped picture of a battery. You take your screwdriver and turn the brass screw down until it bites, firm and solid, but not so hard that you strip the threads. It should feel like tightening a harness buckle, snug, with no wiggle. Now, before that red wire touches the battery's positive post, we must install the gatekeeper. This is your fuse holder, a small black plastic pod housing a blade of metal designed to sacrifice itself if the power ever rushes too fast. You splice it into this red line close to the battery. Do not put the actual fuse blade into the holder just yet. Leave the circuit open and dead while your fingers are busy. Next, you take your black wire, the negative line. It feels smooth, cold, and heavy in your hand. Strip the end, insert it into the negative battery terminal on the controller, and tighten the screw until it holds. Now you have 2 long leads trailing away from the controller, like reins from a horse. Bring those leads to the battery. You take your wrench to the negative post first. Be mindful of your hand. Ensure the metal tool doesn't swing wide and strike anything else. You fasten the bare end of that black wire to the dark, leaden, negative terminal post. It smells of old grease and oxidation as you tighten the nut. Finally, you take the red wire, with its empty fuse holder, and secure it to the bright red positive post. The wires are attached, but the line is still asleep. Reach down, take that small plastic fuse blade, perhaps a bright blue 20-amp link, and push it firmly into the black holder. You will hear a tiny, satisfying snap as it seats. Immediately, look up at the controller's screen. A soft green or blue light wakes up. It hums with no sound, but the numbers appear. 12.6 volts. That is the steady hand of the controller recognizing the heart of the system. The handshake is complete. Step 2 brings in the sun. We turn our attention to the solar panel. If it is sitting out in the yard, it is already alive, gathering the noon light and turning it into a silent, invisible pressure. Before you touch its wires, take an old heavy canvas tarp or a thick horse blanket and throw it over the dark, glassy face of the panel. Block the light entirely. We do not want to work on a live stream. Look at the back of the panel. Emerging from the sealed junction box are two stiff, black cables ending in hard plastic plugs. The MC4 connectors. They click together with a distinct, dry plastic snap that tells you they are weatherproofed against the rain and snow. One is positive, one is negative. You connect your extension wires to these plugs, running them inside to where your controller sits. Look back at the bottom of the controller. Next to the battery terminals, you will see another pair marked with a tiny picture of a sun or a solar array. Just as before, you bring your red positive line from the panel into the positive slot and the black negative line into the negative slot. Tighten those brass screws down until they bite into the copper. Now, walk outside and pull that heavy canvas blanket off the panel. Let the bright, clean light strike the blue-black silicon cells. Walk back inside to your controller and watch the screen. Within a few seconds, a small icon of a sun will appear, and you will see a little blinking arrow begin to move from the sun toward the battery symbol. If your controller has a meter, you will see the voltage rise slightly, 13.2, 13.5. That is the soundless rushing of the sun's energy flowing down through the copper, being smoothed out by the controller and pouring safely into the reservoir of the battery. This brings us to step 3, adding the muscle. This is where most beginners ruin their equipment because they try to wire their inverter directly into the charge controller's small load terminals. Understand this. Those tiny terminals are meant only for a small lantern bulb or a clock. An inverter, when it first wakes up to start a freezer motor, demands a violent, massive gulp of current. If you pull that gulp through the controller, you will smell the bitter, unmistakable scent of burning electronics. As the small circuit board fries itself, the inverter must connect straight to the thick lead posts of the battery itself, bypassing the controller entirely. For this, you need cables as thick as your thumb. Heavy, flexible welding cable wrapped in dense rubber. They must be short, no longer than a few feet, because electricity loses its strength when traveling through long DC lines. You take the heavy red cable, attach another large fuse holder, one with a heavy-duty bolt-down fuse, and secure it to the battery's positive post. Then take the heavy black cable and attach it to the negative post. Connect the other ends to the large brass lugs on the back of your inverter. When you make that final connection, even with the inverter turned off, you might hear a sharp pop and see a tiny blue spark. Do not jump. That is simply the large capacitors inside the inverter taking their first quick drink from the battery. It is normal. Tighten those lugs down with a wrench until they are absolutely immovable. Loose connections create resistance. Resistance creates heat, and heat is the enemy of safety. Your system is now fully assembled. It sits on your bench, a complete, self-contained loop of independent power. The sun feeds the battery through the controller. The battery holds the energy. The inverter stands ready to transform it. But before you flip that switch and plug in your first household appliance, we must talk about how to test the health of what you have just built, and how to read the subtle signs that tell you whether your system is working in harmony or straining toward a breakdown. Now that the wires are set and the indicators are awake, we must stop and understand the invisible forces moving through this copper. It is not enough to simply follow a recipe. A master practitioner knows the why behind the work. Let us pull back the curtain and look at the simple science of what is happening inside these boxes. Without the heavy weight of textbook jargon, think of your solar panel not as a complex electronic machine, but as a specialized water wheel sitting under a waterfall of light. When the sun shines, it rains tiny packets of light energy called photons. When these photons strike the dark silicon wafers inside the panel, they act like physical drops of water hitting the paddles of a wheel. They knock loose tiny, invisible particles called electrons. These electrons have nowhere to go but down the paths we have cleared for them, the copper wires. This movement of electrons is what we call direct current, or DC. It is a one-way street. The electrons flow out from the panel, down the line, and straight toward our storage. But as I mentioned before, the sun is an unsteady river. Clouds pass, shadows fall from overhanging branches, and the flow turns from a torrent to a trickle. This is where your charge controller performs its quiet miracle. If you ran that wild, fluctuating current straight into a battery, it would be like trying to fill a delicate glass bottle with a high-pressure fire hose 1 minute and a leaky roof gutter the next. The battery would overheat, its internal plates would warp, and you would ruin its ability to hold a charge. The controller acts as a smart valve. It senses the pressure coming from the panel and regulates it, keeping the voltage at a steady, gentle push that the battery can absorb without stress. Inside the battery itself, a beautiful chemical dance takes place. When the electrons arrive from the controller, they don't just pile up like wood in a shed. They cause a physical change in the materials inside. In a standard lead-acid battery, the electricity forces lead sulfate on the plates to dissolve back into the liquid acid, turning it into active sponge lead and lead dioxide. We are converting electrical energy into chemical potential. When you turn on an appliance later, that chemical process runs in reverse, releasing those stored electrons back into the wire. It is a reversible scale, balancing back and forth every time the sun rises and sets. But we must speak with absolute honesty about the limits of this magic. Every tool has its boundaries, and knowing where the system fails is just as important as knowing how it works. First, let us look at weather and climate boundaries. This small off-grid setup thrives on direct, clear sunlight. On a bright, cloudless June day, a single 100-watt panel will easily keep your battery topped off while running a small, efficient appliance. But understand this, when the heavy, gray skies of November roll in, or when snow covers the glass, your production will drop drastically. On a deeply overcast day, that same panel might only produce 10 or 15% of its rated capacity. If you experience a week of continuous dark storm clouds, your battery will slowly drain down to nothing if you keep drawing from it. This system is a partner to the seasons. It cannot ignore them. You must adjust your consumption to match the sky. Second, there is the limitation of temperature. Batteries are living chemical systems, and they do not like extreme cold or extreme heat. If you place your battery bank in an uninsulated shed where the winter freeze dips below zero, the chemical reaction slows down to a crawl. A cold battery can lose up to half of its effective capacity simply because the electrons cannot move easily through the chilly liquid inside. Conversely, if you place it in a hot metal box under the blazing summer sun, the heat accelerates the internal degradation, shortening the lifespan of an expensive component by years. To make this method work, you must give your battery a stable home, ideally an insulated box or a cool protected cellar that mimics the steady temperature of the Earth. Third, we must be brutally clear about the types of electrical loads this setup can handle. This comes down to the difference between electronic work and thermal work. Electricity is highly efficient at creating motion or light. Running a small fan motor, spinning the compressor pump of a modern, well-insulated chest freezer, or illuminating high-efficiency LED bulbs. These are low-draw, highly optimized tasks. Where this system fails completely is when you ask it to create heat. To make an electric element glow hot, such as in a hairdryer, a space heater, an electric toaster, or a large water heater, requires an immense, brutal amount of current. Running a simple 1500-watt space heater for just 1 hour would completely hollow out a standard 100-amp-hour battery and likely trip your inverter into an overload failure. For heat, you use wood, propane, or the sun's direct warmth through a window. You do not use a small battery bank. Finally, understand the material limits of the battery itself. You cannot draw a standard lead-acid battery down to completely empty without killing it. If you routinely use more than half of its stored capacity before recharging it, the lead plates inside will become permanently coated in hard sulfate crystals, rendering the battery useless in a matter of months. You must learn to read the voltage meter like a shepherd watches his flock, never letting the reservoir drop below that critical 50% mark, which is roughly 12.1 volts for a standard 12-volt system. This is the true boundary of independent power. It requires you to step away from the mindset of unlimited, mindless consumption that the main grid encourages. It forces you to become mindful of the sun's daily path, the temperature of the air, and the true energy cost of the things you plug in. It is a contract between you and nature. Now that you understand the science of the flow and the hard boundaries of what this small setup can and cannot do, you are ready to look at the practical reality of choosing your pieces. You know how to wire them, and you know why they work. Next, we must look at the specific numbers, so you can size your system correctly for your own specific needs, ensuring you never buy too much or find yourself sitting in the dark with too little. When you stand back and look at these 4 interconnected boxes quietly working on your bench, it is easy to assume this is entirely a modern invention, a product born of recent laboratories and high-tech factories. But the truth runs much deeper into our history. The path to independent, decentralized power was laid down over a century ago by practitioners who believed that energy should belong to the person using it, not just to vast, centralized utilities. The core principle of capturing the sun's direct energy was demonstrated as early as 1839 by the French physicist Alexandre Edmond Becquerel, who discovered the photovoltaic effect, the generation of electricity from light, as a young man working in his father's laboratory. But it wasn't the academic laboratories that brought this into practical reality. It was the inventors who sought self-sufficiency. By the late 1880s, an American inventor named Charles Fritz built the first solid-state solar cells using selenium, installing them on a rooftop in New York City. He wrote with immense foresight that these panels would one day compete with the centralized, coal-fired power plants then being built by Thomas Edison, providing free, localized energy directly to homes without the need for miles of vulnerable wires. At the exact same time, the heart of our system, the lead-acid storage battery, was being perfected by practitioners who needed reliable power where no wires existed. In 1859, Gaston Planté created the first rechargeable battery design, which was quickly adopted by early homesteaders, isolated railway stations, and rural workshops. Long before the modern electric grid stretched across this continent, thousands of independent farms were running small, decentralized electrical systems. In the 1920s and 1930s, before the Rural Electrification Act sought to tie every home to a central grid, companies like Zenith and WindCharger sold thousands of small, independent generation and battery storage setups to families across the Great Plains. These families didn't have engineering degrees. They were farmers and traditional craftsmen who understood how to maintain their own battery banks, check the specific gravity of the liquid inside with a simple glass hydrometer, and manage their daily power based on the wind and the sky. This traditional, localized approach to energy isn't just folk wisdom. It is fully validated by decades of rigorous research and historical bulletins from the very institutions that helped build our agricultural framework. If you look back at the historical extension bulletins published by the United States Department of Agriculture and state university experiment stations from the early 20th century, such as the landmark Nebraska Tractor Test and Rural Energy Bull, ETINs, you will find detailed, plain-spoken guides instructing farmers on how to set up, wire, and maintain independent 32-volt DC battery systems. These historical documents read exactly like the lessons we discussed today. They emphasized heavy-gauge copper wiring to prevent heat loss, the absolute necessity of safety fuses on every line leaving the battery, and the importance of understanding your daily load limits. Modern science hasn't changed these fundamental physical laws. It has simply given us more efficient silicon cells and more compact inverters to do the same work that our grandfathers did with heavy glass jars and wind paddles. Look at the simplicity of what we have discussed. 4 pieces, a handful of copper leads, like connected to like in a quiet, natural order. Why do we continue to let the world convince us that this is a mystery too deep for an ordinary person to touch? Why do we pay a monthly toll for our light, our water, and our basic security when the knowledge to harvest these things ourselves is sitting right here, tested by generations of practitioners? The grid is a modern convenience, to be sure, but it is also a fragile thread. When the storms roll through Lancaster County and the high wires snap under the weight of ice or wind, the world changes instantly for those who rely entirely on a distant powerhouse. The lights go out, the pumps stop, and helplessness sets in. But it does not have to be that way for you. I want to invite you to step across that line, from being a helpless consumer to becoming a capable caretaker of your own home. Do not let the dense manuals or the expensive corporate advertisements intimidate you. You do not need to buy a massive, multi-$1,000 array to begin this journey. Start small. Find a single 100-watt panel, a simple 20-amp charge controller, a reliable deep-cycle battery, and a modest inverter. Sit down at your own workbench or your kitchen table on a quiet afternoon. Strip the wires yourself. Feel the weight of the copper. Tighten the brass screws down until they hold firm. Push that first fuse into its slot and watch Small's digital screen wake up to tell you it is ready. There is a deep, quiet satisfaction that comes the first time you plug a tool or a lamp into a system you built with your own hands. You watch the light fill the room, and you realize that it isn't costing you a single penny, and it isn't dependent on a single corporation or a distant switchboard. It is your light, made by the sun, caught by your panel, and directed by your own understanding. That is more than just practical self-sufficiency. It is a restoration of a traditional freedom that our people have cherished for centuries. Take it one box at a time. Go slow. Mind the natural order of the connections. Respect the silent power stored within the battery. And do the work with a mindful, unhurried hand. The people who built our communities understood that true security isn't bought from someone else. It is grown and maintained at home.